Before we begin, we'd like to give special thanks to all of our sponsors for helping make this event possible each year. Specifically, thank you to CRL FormFox for being our title sponsor for 5 consecutive years. And thank you to our platinum sponsors, AuraSure Technologies, Psychmedics, Samba Safety, UKG, and Quest Diagnostics.
Hi, and thank you so much for joining us for this session on transportation compliance best practices. Today, we're joined by Stephen Spencer, DISA's General Manager of Transportation, and Morgan Reynolds, Director of Governance and Risk at DISA. Stephen, Morgan, how are you guys doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great. I'm excited for this session.
I'm doing great also. Excited to be back for another day with DISA.
Great. Well, before we jump into the presentation, I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, use the Q&A button at the bottom right of the player. Any questions we're unable to answer today will reach back out to you after Day with DISA. Additionally, we'll make a copy of the presentation available for download on the Materials tab at the end of the session. With that being said, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Thomas. Hey there, and welcome to the transportation compliance conversation that Morgan and I will be having today. My name is Stephen Spencer. I've been in this industry probably about 24 years now with other CTPAs, TPAs, CRAs, and joined DISA in 2018 to lead their transportation. Morgan?
And I'm Morgan Reynolds. I've been with DISA for just over 4 years, also joined in 2018, and I've been in the industry since about 2010, so coming on 13 years. And I am a licensed attorney, but I just want to give a quick disclaimer that anything we talk about today is not legal advice. I'm not your attorney. I work for DISA. But if you're not sure on things and need legal advice, please reach out to your attorney and your in-house counsel or outside counsel. Stephen?
Thanks. Today we're going to cover some areas: drug testing, background checks, DQ files, clearinghouse, a quick mention on fuel tax, and a little bit about occupational health, of course, in the transportation space. That mostly means DOT physicals. On the next slide, we'll get started with our drug testing. We'll start with the minimum that we probably all know, which is the DOT 5-panel urinalysis test. That has some advantages, the advantages being that it's a well-established process. There's an industry to support that process, whether that's from the thousands of collection sites that exist, numerous TPAs, the numerous labs that are out there, well-established in the consistency and process of processing samples. There are some potential limitations with the detection window being relatively small, with THC being the longest from 1 to 7 days, and most other metabolites 2 to 3 days. Sometimes you're not going to detect that longer use. Many drivers have learned how to circumvent the process, whether that is just by abstaining, or we've all heard of the different ways they can adulterate or bring in other samples. And then collection of the urine also has the ick factor. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about a best practice that would be hair testing. So we just talked about the ick factor of urine. That kind of goes away with hair. But in addition to using urine, and you'll see on the right-hand slide here, you expand that window of detection. So you're able to pick up the longer, where we could actually be into months of use rather than just a few days. I think most of us in the industry are probably aware of the work that JB Hunt and Psychmedics have done, where they basically did side-by-side tests of the urinalysis and the hair testing, and saw over a 7-time more positives with hair than urine, which would tell us that probably the usage of drugs is not going down, but the ability to circumvent the tests have become more sophisticated.
That chart on the slide is a great one for the attendees to look and understand and digest, because, you know, in our experience, I'm sure we've seen people test positive on the urine and not the hair, and on the hair and not the urine. And it's important to understand the detection windows change, you know, and that's, you know, why the best testing protocol would have both. You know, it's you're doing your mandated testing that we talked about before, the DOT 5 panel, but then you want to have a drug-free work environment. And so you're going to supplement that with the hair test, which is a longer look back and will show a habit of use versus the more recent in the detection window. So I really like that chart, and I hope that hits home for our attendees.
Thanks, Morgan. Good call out. Another best practice would be the use of e-chains wherever available. This cuts down dramatically on things like errors or putting the wrong modality or the wrong test type, like DOT versus non-DOT. If you have to alter a paper chain, that never goes well. Whereas if you create an e-chain authorization, that's very clear and concise and can be tracked much easier. We also see an advantage in turnaround time. So with using an e-chain, we can see up to a day faster turnaround time versus a paper form that would be used for the exact same test. Next slide.
Yeah, and I think, you know, attendees will want to consider going to sites that have electronic chain support for those reasons. But from a compliance side, from a risk side, you know, it cuts down the errors, it reduces the deciphering the handwriting. So all those things factor into the improved turnaround time, which will ultimately save you time and money, which I know is important to everyone, because it reduces the time to hire when it's e-chain. So yeah, I'm a big fan of electronic chain of custody, and we've had those with DISA for many, many years and have great processes there. Okay, so these are some things that I thought our attendees should consider when evaluating a drug testing program. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of these because we have hit on a few of them already. But these are the things that, you know, a best-in-class program is looking at, you know, complete chain of custody management. Another one we haven't mentioned right now, but, you know, when people do what we call non-DOT testing, non-mandated testing, they need to understand what they're getting with that. And I've seen programs that are non-DOT where they don't use an MRO. And so, you know, always use an MRO, and I'm going to repeat that later on, but always, always, always use an MRO for non-negatives. You know, people cut corners and it just causes more problems. As I just mentioned, electronic chain of custody forms are, you know, something that's essential in 2023 to good program management. And then one thing that I see a lot that is missed is the random pool management. So I think this year the FMCSA percentage is 50% of the pool you'll test annually. Now, you know, understanding that you need to manage your pool. So if you start out with 100 workers, 100 drivers, you're going to test, you know, 50% of that pool. But if you have reductions throughout the year and go to 75 and you're not managing your pool, you're going to be over-selecting and then having people that are unavailable because they're no longer working. So you're going to get to that 51 tests, but also, you know, your pool average could be down to, you know, 80 to 85. So you're over testing, that's costing you money, and you're not running an effective pool there when you're not managing it. And then, you know, we've already talked about the methodologies, the urine, the hair, the oral fluid, you know, also breath alcohol is another testing methodology to consider in a best practice, you know, beyond just the mandated DOT random breath alcohol. Breath alcohol is something that you can do on a non-DOT random basis also. Customized panels. So we get a lot of questions about panels and understanding the panels. So we know DOT, it's, we talked about that earlier. It's a fairly standard process. The panel's well established. But where we see people not understanding their testing program, it's on the non-DOT side. So they may run a test through DISA or any TPA for that matter, and it's at one panel. And then the donor tests positive, and then they run to a site and do their own test to say, hey, I'm not a drug user, and it's on a completely different panel. And so understanding that, the cutoff levels and things that you're testing for can vary across labs and across programs is important. And then, synthetic testing, expanded opioids, things like that are, readily available within the industry. One thing that I'm anticipating growing in the coming years, just based on watching the media and coverage, and also the reality that there were, I think, 109,000 overdoses on fentanyl in the past year. I think we're going to see that grow as a testing type on the panel. I think we'll see that grow over the next 24 to 48 months. Stephen, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with we'll definitely be seeing that. And at this last ATA MCNE conference, the Safety Policy Committee, this was actually debated on what should happen with fentanyl and these synthetics, and should it be looked at. So the debate has begun. Okay.
Yeah, so we'll watch for that. And if they're talking about it in the transportation sector, you can bet other industries are watching it. This is obviously a transportation focused session, but we'll see who jumps in first there. And then the other thing is the types of testing. So on the DOT requirements, it's pretty well established, but just types of testing, there's pre-employment, random, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, return to duty and follow-up, and then understanding the mobile collections and on-site testing. And I just want to mention a couple of things to make sure your managers are trained on reasonable suspicion testing. There's a whole training mechanism for them to understand, and that's something that's frequently missed. And then understanding the difference between return to duty testing and then somebody just who left the pool and needs, what would be called pre-employment testing. It's different. So, Stephen, do you want to go into that? The return to duty versus like pre-access or getting back into the pool?
Sure. Well, as the regulation states, before you can be put in a random pool, you have to have a negative pre-employment test. So typically in a life cycle, there's the pre-employment test and you enter into the random program. If at any time then you are non-negative, to be able to get back into the random program, you're going to have to go through the return to duty process, which is much different. So kind of the flag there is, it's the difference between I'm taking off time being a driver, I'm going to go into construction for a while, I'm going to have a new pre-employment test because it's greater than 30 days to go back into the random pool, versus I've actually had a non-negative event and I've had to go through an SAP and basically have my return to duty and then get back into the pool. So those are kind of the two differences. It's, I've kind of left doing this for some reason and I come back and I need another test to get into the pool versus there's been a non-negative event.
Yeah, and that's the most common situation, is that the DER will send someone for a return to duty test because they're returning to the job and they maybe took a leave or whatever, and so they're no longer in the random pool, which is great because they're managing their random pool. I like that part, but the test type should be pre-employment to get back into the testing pool, because a return to duty is a different process, and it flags the follow-up screening and things like that. And at TPA, if they get a return to duty, they're going to have most likely some verifications that they went through a SAP program if they're managing the processes correctly. So just a couple of things to consider in the drug testing program. I think we can move on from this slide.
Well, I'll make one more note if I could, since this is a conversation. On the mobile collections, I think in the industry, we're most familiar with that happening during a post-accident event or something of that nature. But I will say there have been kind of in the industry, some people looking at what is the expense of me sending drivers, for example, for pre-employment, kind of having them go various places and do various things versus I'm going to bring them into my singular location anyway. And a lot of times, if you get a high concentration of those tests being done, you might look at the cost benefit or the analysis of, kind of sending them out versus I've got them here. Let's have a mobile collector come on site for a pre-employment event and do the testing. So we've kind of seen some of that happening in the industry as well.
Interesting. Okay. And then, we've covered some of this, but, understanding the reasons for testing, there's mandated testing, Department of Transportation, DOT, which we've talked about extensively, and then what I would call non-DOT testing. So one of the things that, we see is people DRs adopting a non-DOT testing policy and just saying we're following the DOT regulations. And what I would say is you always need a separate policy. So this is the compliance side. Is you can't have a non-DOT testing program without a policy. And then in 2023. You really can't have a one-size-fits-all non-DOT policy. It's going to have to be state-specific, considering all the different laws in the different states, and that is going to take a lot of time to do. I don't think it's really possible at this point to have a policy which meets all 50 states. So you're going to need to engage with subject matter experts on a policy creation on the non-DOT side. But, some of the reasons for testing beyond the mandated testing is, contractor requirements, pre-employment, pre-access, random, reasonable suspicion. We see, as we talked about, the type of panel and type of specimen being tested for. But those are the types of testing we see under the non-DOT is really contractor requirements, employee testing, people that want to have a drug-free work environment, because if you don't test, the workers know, and the drug users flock to those employers who don't test at all. Some of the risks to here is not meeting the mandated minimum. So let's go back to the DOT, as I talked about the testing percentage and the rules. If you don't meet your 50% for 2023, you could be subject to fines. You also could, not be eligible for jobs, because some of the owners, they have auditing to make sure their contractors all meet the requirements. So you could have, loss of business, loss of money on that. Only doing the minimum testing or cutting corners on unregulated testing. So recall I talked about before, always use a medical review officer. It's the thing that causes the most problems, I would say, with non-DOT testing is just receiving the non-negatives directly without using an MRO. And in many states it is required, but I still see some employers, it's a non-DOT test, receiving it directly, and then having the HR person talk to or the DER talk to the potential employee about their test, and it just causes problems. So, and then the other thing that we've talked about already, but just want to reiterate, is understanding the panel. So in your policy, you typically want to have, what you're testing for, the type of specimen, and then I would consider, the panel and making sure that that's in there. because, you'll see donors go and get their own test to prove that they're not a drug user. But it's always a different panel, and it's always different cutoff levels. And Stephen and I have been around a long time, and we've seen the same thing over and over. It's like, oh, they tested positive on Wednesday, but then they went on Friday to a different site and had a test, and it's negative. And what's the deal? And it's without fail, it's a panel difference. So understanding that and making sure that you're notifying your prospective employees or your employees of what they're going to be tested for is important. Do you have anything to add to this one, Stephen?
I think you've covered it well.
Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and move on to background screening. All right.
All right, we'll move away from drugs to backgrounds. So certainly for FMCSA, the 3-year driving record, regardless of state, so it's got to be the 3 years comprehensive. The clearinghouse now, as of the 6th of this month of 2023, is now fully in effect. It's been around for 3 years. So being sure to do your pre-employment check and your annual query. And I hope you will be able to join the session we'll be having tomorrow with Brian Price and Stacy Johnson. Brian is the chief of the drug and alcohol programs for FMCSA, and Stacy is the program administrator for FMCSA. So they'll be going into a lot of detail around clearinghouse, but obviously it's even a higher priority now that we're fully launched now, 3 years into it.
And I know we have a whole session on clearinghouse, but I just want to make sure we highlight the third bullet there about the 3-year previous safety. And you might, and I apologize if I interrupted you, Stephen, and you were going to hit on this, but one of the things that's causing the most confusion in 2023 when we're fully into the to the clearinghouse is what to do about the safety work history for drivers. Is that going away, Stephen?
That is not. So if we go back to what the regulation was before the clearinghouse, and what it effectively meant for trucking companies was you would be calling other companies, maybe you use a database or something out there in the industry, but you typically would be making calls to people at the other company, and you would be saying, I need 3 years of previous drug and alcohol verifications on Stephen Spencer. And remember, you would also then ask, I need 3 years of safety sensitive operation history for Stephen Spencer. So in other words, their employment history, kind of what they drove, what loads they hauled, eligible for rehire, those sorts of things, which is completely different than tell me about previous drug and alcohol tests. So the clearinghouse is only about those questions when you would call and say, tell me about the previous drug and alcohol.
Yeah, and so I think we're going to see employers mess this up, and I think that there'll be fines for not doing the safety work history. It may not be fines, it may be warnings, because the way they've done this has created so much confusion. But it's the thing that as we've gone into 2023, people think that the query satisfies all background check requirements, and it's just not true. And so if you take away one thing from this, I'd like you to take that away, that you still need to do the safety work history as part of a pre-employment background check for FMCSA.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent call out. And those of us that have been around certainly a while and think about what you used to do, they were two completely separate sets of questions, right? And so in the clearinghouse is only answering the questions about previous drug and alcohol, not about how I did in my job performance, my safety sensitive job performance. So great call out. So yeah, you're still going to have to be doing those previous employment inquiries. And then finally, the annual MVR. So you still have to run at a minimum of every 12 months a motor vehicle report on your drivers. It's very similar to drug testing. This is something that's been around a very long time, and there's a well-established process and an industry that has grown up to support it. Driving records and the clearinghouse are highly automated, so very quick turnaround time. Some potential limitations. So when we're talking about MVRs, I made that call out that said 3 years regardless of state. It can be a challenge sometimes if a driver comes in and says, you know, here's my CDL number and I drove for 2 years, then you're not meeting the requirement of 3 years. And so you have to go back to the driver and say, have you not driven for 3 years, or is there another state where you've surrendered a CDL? And we also have the issue, obviously drivers, as soon as they have any kind of a violation, they're supposed to report that to you immediately. And sometimes you don't find those until the next annual MVR check. So there are some limitations to this process, even though it's a well-established process. Is there anything else you would add, Morgan?
So when you say that they have violations unreported, right, and it's a self-disclosure process for our attendees, would that be only on the job type things, like when they're driving for the job, or would that be off the clock things that should be reported that they may not discover until after the annual inquiry?
No, great. Really what this would be is anything that would be reported on your CDL. So speeding, you know, improper lane change, anything that would be a violation or possible negative on their CDL, on their motor vehicle report. They're supposed to self-report, but a lot of times that doesn't happen. So let's say in January, you ran their annual MVR and then they go and get an egregious speeding ticket in February and you don't find out about it until the next January. That can be a problem.
Yeah, and so that's important to educate the drivers of, you know, what should be self-reported, because, you know, they may get the speeding ticket in their own car on their own time, but it's still going to show up on their driving history check. Yeah. So they should be reporting any incidents.
Right. Good call. Next slide.
I think we can move on. Yeah.
Yeah. So we recommend there is a database. If you're not familiar with it, it's actually AMVA supports this database, and it's called CIDLIS, the Commercial Driver's License Information System. So it's a way to independently verify. So like before, we said the driver comes in, they only have 2 years of driving record, and they say, you know, I've never held a CDL anywhere else. Well, how do you independently verify that? CIDLIS will help you do that, because with some identifiers on the driver, it's going to disclose up to the last 3 CDLs that have been held. So you can get that full 3-year look back. And in some cases, you know, drivers surrender a CDL, they don't have that information with them when they're applying for the next job. And so it can be a challenge for you to be able to run the motor vehicle report in a state where they've surrendered a CDL if you don't have the identifiers that that state requires. By running CIDLIS, is what it's called, by running that, you'll be able to pick up those previous CDL numbers, and it will be easy for you to run motor vehicle reports in those states.
And Stephen, I'm sure you have stories of the past where people would, you know, prior to CIDLIS, they'd jump from state to state where they'd have, you know, some serious violations, and then they'd move to a different state. And, you know, that, do you want to go over the origins of this?
Yeah, so if you go all the way back, right? I mean, if you really go back into the old days, a lot of drivers would have more than one license. And basically they would know how many points they had on each license. And if they got pulled over, they just reached over into their Rolodex and handed, you know, the highway patrolman, let's say, a license they knew they had fewer points on. So that was certainly one issue that CIDLIS was created for. There's also the law of reciprocity. So when a driver surrenders a license in Texas, Texas should transfer that information to wherever the driver now has the new license. Well, that doesn't always happen or happen in a window that is appropriate or that is within the regulation. So SIDLIS helps to kind of close that gap as well. So you can immediately know surrendered license in Texas, got new license in Missouri, and you can run both of those states. So yeah, it really goes back to helping get rid of somebody carrying multiple licenses, and then also the reciprocity between states.
And on SIDLIS, I just wanted to add that, good governance, there's no reason not to run SIDLIS. And understanding the results is also important, because you're running, so say you run me, just using Morgan Reynolds as an example, and I have 3 previous CDLs, and then you run those motor vehicle reports. Well, it's not negative for them to be closed, right? That's what you would expect. You're doing it to make sure that they don't have multiple licenses or a serious violation that didn't get transferred across. So when you run, Texas, and you get the current active license, and then you run, Oklahoma, and the surrounding states where I also had licenses, in this hypothetical, you would expect those to be closed and not active licenses. So understanding the results is also important, and something that we get questions a lot about. So that's what the expectation would be that you wouldn't get results on the 3 previous, but it's good governance to run them.
Yeah, you should only have one active CDL at any time, and that goes back to the way old days where some drivers did carry multiple licenses just so they could kind of deal out which one had the fewest points on it. Good point.
All right, and so I just wanted to, I really like this slide, and I think the continuous MVR monitoring. So we've talked about MVRs and an annual inquiry into the motor vehicle. The best practice and the best in class programs are doing MVR monitoring, because you cut down on the time, and as it says here, you're gonna reduce your risk of the non-reporting, but you're also gonna have your employees knowing that they're in a monitoring program, so they're gonna report up any violations quicker to you, and then they're also going to know that they don't have 10 months before it's run again, because they know when most employees are going to know when they're run. So it's going to lead to fewer citations and incidents. But I think overall, this slide, the bottom line, the 22% reduction, 14% reduction, and 32% reduction are things that you're going to want to take away from this. Anything you want to add here, Stephen?
Yeah, so, and beyond that, I think anybody that does cross-border probably has a story or two about a driver getting to a border and being denied entry because of a suspended license. So this is something that would help avoid that cost and that time impact, is if you knew their CDL was already suspended, you wouldn't try to send them into Canada. So beyond all the other.
So let's unpack that for a second. So
okay.
So you have someone driving and going across the border, and they show up, and then Canada is going to not let them in because they have, that would be like a DUI or something like that on their history, or what are the type of things that would result in a denial at the border?
Yeah, it certainly could be. So anything that causes a suspension, for sure, and it could be a DUI. Canada is most notable because they will check CDL license before. Something else that can happen is non-payment for spousal support, and a license can be suspended in some states for that reason. So anything that causes a CDL to go into a suspended status could prevent you from crossing the border.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, you definitely don't want that happening.
No, because
then how do you get the load back from the border? Also, that they couldn't, because now you know that they have a problem if they're denied at the border, and so it causes logistical nightmare.
Yeah, so usually what has to happen there is you remove the driver that has the suspended license, and now you have to get another driver there to take the load on. So now you have the expense of getting a driver there to be able to take the load.
So I think the takeaway here is that the monitoring is going to reduce your risk in an extreme fashion. You know, using that the border crossing one, that's thousands of dollars of logistics and flying someone and or getting them there.
However, you're going to get them there, and you're probably going to, you know, whatever time frame you've guaranteed. Now you're against that crunch.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
yeah. All right, so we can move on here.
And then finally, in the background screening area, just wanted to bring up, and this kind of piggybacks on what Morgan was talking about earlier, where confusion comes in. I can remember back in the day when it was CSA 2010 and the PSP was coming out, and you know, people were saying, oh, we don't have to do previous employment checks anymore. Because this says pre-employment screening. And so I think people thought that this was that, and it is not. So it really is the 3 years of roadside inspections. And then when we talk about inspections, it'll also indicate any serious safety concerns that driver had during that roadside inspection, and 5 years of crash data. Now that sounds nowhere near the what kind of vehicle did they drive, you know, did they have any DOT recordable accidents? That is completely different than the 3-year safety check that we talked about earlier. So really wanted to make that call out. Sometimes we have confusion there. Although it's a good product to run, you know, it can help you kind of understanding your basics and at your driver level and things like that. So certainly recommend looking into that, but not to confuse it with the 3-year previous safety sensitive.
Yeah, we have the best in class programs that we have to include the PSP, the pre-employment screening program. Frequently confused, as you said, but you do get some interesting data on the PSP reports. You know, we have, as part of our internal compliance program, some auditing functions, and I have reviewed some of the PSPs to just look at them and make sure they're, you know, being processed correctly internally. And you do see, you know, the violations or the inspections and things that they're not, that the driver didn't have, and the violations, you know, the lights out, things like that on the truck that they get written up for that show up on the PSP, right?
Yeah, and that's, you know, oftentimes carriers are using this PSP as an educational tool. So to your point, if there's a bulb that should have been noticed at the pre-trip inspection, right? So they can kind of say, hey, let us retrain you on how to do your pre-trip inspection. So another way the PSP is used.
I think we can move on to DQ.
Sure. DQ. So just a real quick overview, the driver application. Obviously, the pre-employment application that you're using for the driver needs to be included. If your questionnaire is not in your app, then or in your application, then that needs to be a separate piece as well. Copy of your MVR, both pre-employment and your annual recheck, your certified road test, your medical examiner certificates, both your pre-employment physical and then your renewals. And then if you have any medical exceptions, then you'll have to have your skill performance evaluation in that file as well. The nice thing about the paper files, which is what we're talking about here, is there's really no system learning curve, right? Except whatever system you have. You're basically creating a file cabinet and putting paper files in the file cabinet. Now, there's a lot of things. First of all, there's your file cabinet's not going to help remind you when it is time to do another MVR. As we know, with the physicals, those cards can go anywhere from a 3-month card to a 2-year card. And if you don't have something to help remind you of that process, you could miss doing one of those renewals. So that's kind of something lacking in the paper. Obviously, the paper is also susceptible to any kind of disaster. I know plenty of different areas that have had this problem, but I can think of a few in Nashville where flooding is very, very well known, completely wiped out their DQ files that were all in paper, and there was no backup. So what do? That becomes a real problem between you and your DOT auditor. And then paper files are very difficult to share across different office locations. I can think of several trucking companies that started off fairly small and then started buying other companies across the nation. And it became very difficult to share those paper files, or if you want to streamline the process where this person does this part of the DQ process, this person does another part, it's virtually impossible to do that if it's paper files and you're in different locations. Morgan, is there anything you want to add on DQ paper files?
Yeah, I think you hit on what makes me nervous about the paper DQ files, and I think we're going to talk about a better process shortly. But trying to have from my perspective, trying to have good governance, you typically want to have centralized processes, and it's really difficult when you're doing a paper DQ file because it's going to be reliant on the people at the location meeting with the driver, and then having to centralize all of the documentation. It just causes me a little anxiety there. But yeah, let's move on to talk about the better process.
All right. So next slide. So just consider using an electronic online DQ provider. So we just talked about what happens if all your paper documents are gone. Obviously, in the electronic cloud world, your documents are already backed up and electronic. So it really, if one place has a flood, they're still in the cloud somewhere, which is the next kind of bullet, which is the redundancy in case of a disaster. You can have multiple users logged in and looking at the DQ files regardless of location. Again, the centralization point becomes the system of truth or the system of record, and that everybody can see. Then if you use a provider, just be sure that that provider actually does a full DQ compliance services. There are a lot that say they're DQ, and it's just an electronic file cabinet. Sometimes it'll have reminders, which maybe that's all you want to do, but you should consider, if you want full kind of compliance support, that provider is actually reviewing every document that comes in. I often say, don't be surprised if you're using an electronic file cabinet if somebody says, here's my motor vehicle report, and it's a box top to serial, because there's nobody checking it. So just things to keep in mind. Also with electronic versions, if they have a kiosk mode, you can basically give access to the auditor just the files they need. Whereas if it's paper files, well, they will tell you what files they want, but if they're sitting next to your file cabinet, they can pick and choose and see other things as well. With electronic, it's very efficient. If there's a kiosk process, you can put exactly what they've asked for directly in front of them. So I'd say really the only learning or the only limitations, you would have to learn the DQ system. Some people might say cost, but when you really think the cost of paper and the cost of the risk of what if I lose all of that paper, I think that could trade off in the end anyway. Morgan, did I cover everything you wanted to in the electronic?
Yeah, you hit on what I was going to take issue with on this one, which is the limitation of cost, which I would disagree with, because I think you're costing yourself money if you do the paper side. And we all saw it in the last couple of years, the Great Resignation, the people, the turnover. And when you have paper files and turnover, things are lost, and it's not a criticism of the people outgoing. It's just that's how I've seen it go. Is that paper files are filed differently and go missing. And so when we talk about cost, I think you're eventually going to be saving money on having an online DQ provider in comparison to the paper files. It may be a short-term cost savings, but long-term it's going to cause you more headaches and more money because you're going to have to redo a lot of the documents at some point. So that's where the only thing I take issue with is cost. I think ultimately an online DQ provider will save you money. But you know, don't want to go on too long because I think we're running up against the time here, so we'll keep it moving.
Next slide. So
Clearinghouse.
yeah, just real quick, the minimum requirements, obviously, pre-employment queries, annual queries are the minimum that you're going to have to do. Clearinghouse, like I said earlier too, we won't go into a lot of detail in Clearinghouse because we have a very great session of detailed information. So do you want to add anything, Morgan?
Yeah, I think we've covered the clearinghouse earlier, and then the limitations of it are just the drug testing history. One thing just to call out would be an owner-operator process. If you're someone who's a single driver, you know, you need to be using a CTPA and an owner-operator program for the clearinghouse.
I believe that's on the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, I think
so
I think the minimums and the best practice got broke apart on this. So yeah, that's yeah. So keep going. You're right. That's on
yeah. So if you're an owner operator, you need to designate a TPA. And understanding what an owner operator is, it's a single driver who has their own like small business as a driver. So you can't run your own program and do all of that. You need to have a TPA run it, and it should be obvious, but for good governance to ensure that the randoms are random and all that kind of stuff. And then, you know, that things are reported to the clearinghouse. And we do expect more enforcement here. So this is an area to watch on the clearinghouse. So sorry to steal your thunder here on the best practice, but yeah, that's the one that I would talk about.
Absolutely, and I think there's a lot of confusion around the owner operator piece because it's a special flavor of clearinghouse in that, you know, there's basically the owner operators must register and they must identify CTPA to work on their behalf. So yeah, that's a good call out. The other ones here, you know, I put on here, explain to drivers why they should register. Under the regulation, every driver doesn't have to. There's nothing compulsory that says they must until there's a full query. If a full query is run, then the driver has to be able to log in and give permission for that full query to be run. And the other nice thing about Clearinghouse is at any time, a driver can go in and see what information is there on them. So if they will register, they can do that. Otherwise, they can't. So it's probably a good idea to have that conversation with your driver and say, absolutely, there's no requirement that you do, but if there's a full query or you want to see your information, you're going to have to be registered. And then the other thing is monitor your query balance, which is basically the what you pay to access the clearinghouse. And if you have a CTPA that's doing your limited queries, your annual queries, your pre-employment queries, that CTPA cannot purchase those for you. So that's 100% on you to keep query balance in there. I think if we're good, we can go to the next slide.
I think this is the last area we're going to cover, the fuel tax. So why don't you take this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's some confusion around this. I think the confusion might be around the need for some Canadian provinces are a part of this as well. So we've talked about Canada a little bit. If you're driving through there, basically you do have to comply if you drive through 2 or more participating states or provinces. And so this is a quarterly reporting, and you are apportioning miles. Basically, you're buying gas one place, and then you're driving on other people's roads. Well, where you bought the gas would normally get all the tax money, but the IFTA fuel tax requirement apportions that tax out to those other states or provinces you drive through. So if you aren't familiar with this, certainly there are vendors out there that can help you with it. And these are the minimum requirements. So basically all 50 states participate in this, and then some of the provinces in Canada. And if you want to go to the next slide. So just, there's a lot of words on here, so I'm just going to pick out some kind of critical pieces. There's ELD, and sometimes gets mixed in with fuel tax and hours of service. Some of the ELDs will give you enough information to do your fuel tax. What you really need to pay attention to is pings of at least 10 minutes. So the pings can't be longer than that, and you have to include your odometer readings. So if your ELD is not producing that or not at that resolution, then this isn't going to work. That's not going to work for fuel tax. I would say, and I know we're running up against time here, so I will just say for manual trip sheets, for fuel reporting, and for bulk fuel is keep good records. Vehicle number, date, miles if you're driving, receipts that tie back to the vehicle number. Those are all key things that you want to make sure you're doing. And then make sure you have accurate vehicle information. So your gross vehicle weight, number of axles, plate information, and that's really going to be required for your accuracy in reporting. And then physicals, this is the occupational health that we talked about a little bit earlier. Many years ago, we rolled out the certified medical examiner registry. You want to make sure either you are or whoever your TPA or people that you've selected to do this for you are checking that registry before a physical is done. The basics are going to be obviously a vision check, blood pressure, hearing, reflex, lung function, neurological exam, and tell your drivers be prepared for urine. So, don't use the bathroom just before you go. So just be sure and tell them they were going to have to give a urine sample as well. I would say the biggest trend here has been in the past, every carrier, as soon as a driver came for new hire orientation or before they came to new hire orientation, they just did a new physical. I think we saw this kind of really shift in 2020 where more and more carriers are accepting whatever's on the current ME card. So if you had a 2-year card and there's more than 30 days left on it, a lot of people are just accepting that, putting it in the DQ and setting, okay, this is when you need to get your next physical. Again, where it used to be, I don't care if you had a 2-year card and you've got 20 months left on it, you're getting a new physical for me. So that's just kind of an industry shift that we've seen. Morgan, anything on physicals you want to?
Yeah, I think the, making sure you're reviewing the results that come in. And then also I was going to say, not waiting until there's just 30 days remaining would be the best practice, but I understand the cost that you're talking about. And I think the trends are, accepting the time remaining. But, I think that there'd be a cost benefit analysis where, the time away from work to do that, if it's within 3 months, maybe you have a cutoff of a little more aggressive than just accepting 30 days because they're going to have to go and do that. But, I understand the trends, and so that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I completely agree that that's really the trend and not necessarily the best practice. And you mentioned there's really 2 things you need to be looking at the long form for. There's completeness, like is everything filled out? But someone along their line needs to really look and make sure that it makes sense. So someone with very high blood pressure that's uncontrolled shouldn't have a 2-year card. And if they're getting a 2-year card, that's kind of a problem. So there's really completeness and compliance that needs to be reviewed.
All right. So we have a couple of minutes, I think, for a few questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple quick questions. First off, before we jump into those questions, I want to thank both of you for your time and effort pulling this content together today. It was extremely impactful and informative. So real quick, I know we don't have a ton of time. Let's dive straight in. Can I do a urine test with an expanded panel and still meet DOT requirements? Or do I have to run 2 separate tests?
You can't do that. So the DOT panel is mandated. So it's going to have to be a DOT chain of custody form with the 5-panel test, and then you'd have to run an additional test, and it would be a separate collection process, which is important to understand. You know, it's a separate collection for the second test, different void, and that would be for the expanded opiates. And if someone wanted to add fentanyl, which we talked about during the presentation, yeah, it'd have to be 2 separate tests.
We've got a comment here I'd like to get your thoughts on. My big concern about adding hair is that it'll make finding new drivers harder. What are your thoughts on that, Stephen?
That's a fair concern. I would say, but the drivers that you're eliminating are probably habitual drug users. What the J.B. Hunt psychometric study saw as well is, as the word got out that hair testing was being used, they saw fewer and fewer positives, which meant those people, knowing they were doing hair, stopped applying at J.B. Hunt. So I think in the long run, that's probably a good thing. I don't think it would reduce the number of good drivers that are not using substances from applying. It's basically just those that may have a problem.
Just to add on to that, sorry, is, you know, it may be something that in the short term does reduce your number of people, you know, applying or drivers, but long term it's going to save you money because you're getting rid of the drug users who are able to get past a urine, the minimum, and follow the best practice. So as we talked about during the presentation, if you do a cost benefit analysis, I think your benefit is going to far outweigh the cost, which cost wouldn't necessarily be monetary in this. It's the availability of drivers is what the question was. So
that's good info. Does driver monitoring pick up changes across all 50 states?
It will vary by your vendor and exactly what the states allow. So I'll give an example of the New York LINS program or something of that nature. So you'll really, whenever you pick a vendor for driver monitoring, that's certainly a question to ask. What states are monitored? How are they monitored? And the kind of the key word to ask for is, what is a triggering event? That's kind of what you'll want to look at as you're choosing a vendor for driver monitoring.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to both of you again for spending your time with us today. We're at the end of our scheduled time, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up, but I want to thank our attendees as well. Your participation is always appreciated, and we hope to see you at our next session. Thank you.